Good evening. I want to welcome you all to the second lecture of this year's series of Harvard Science Lectures. This is a series of talks that's tailored for a general audience to highlight exciting science that is happening at Harvard right now and how it relates to the world around us. And tonight's lecture will be given by Katie Hinde, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology here at Harvard. Katie's educational background is in anthropology, starting with a bachelor's degree from the University of Washington. And then since the start of her graduate work at UCLA in 2002, she has investigated the first substance that mammals have evolved to consume, the mother's milk. So her research centers on how mother's milk contributes to infant development and behavior, including social behaviors. So in 2011, she established her comparative lactation lab here at Harvard, which studies both humans and non-human primates. And that's when I actually first met Katie, when she joined the faculty. And we had what I thought was a really fascinating conversation, linking my research on the molecules that are involved in taste perception with her research on lactation. So I think she'll give us a fabulous talk. She has garnered a number of professional accolades for her research, but she's also really well known for her ability to disseminate her research on milk and lactation in a way that is really accessible to the general public, to clinicians, and to researchers. So, and this includes her blog called Mammals Suck Milk. So please join me in welcoming Katie to the podium.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you guys for braving missing part of tonight's game to be here and hear me talk to you. And I know you guys are already going to know the punchline, but I want you to imagine a magic potion. Okay? This potion is going to provide you all the fats and proteins and calories you need for energy and to build your body. It's going to provide you with the minerals and vitamins and everything for your cellular function. It is going to provide you with the immunofactors that protect you before your own immune system is fully functional. And it's going to provide you a number of hormones that tell you about your mother's physiological state and help affect your physiological state. It's going to provide you the water for your hydration. And naturally, this magic potion is why mammals suck. Mother's milk. And one of the things that I encounter a lot when I tell people what I study is this question of, well, don't we already know about milk? And this is because milk is ubiquitous in the environment. We can go into the grocery store and we can buy any number of very, very delicious milk products. And you can purchase infant formula, which ostensibly replicates the magic potion of mother's milk. And this ubiquity has a very important downfall, which is that we take milk for granted. And we lose sight of the fact that the substance of mother's milk has been shaped by natural selection for over 300 million years. It has been favored for a number of functions within the developing infant. And it's amazing in how little we actually know about it. So just to give you some background, mammary glands in milk do not fossilize well, so there are a number of active hypotheses in this area, all somewhat well supported. And they are trying to figure out why milk first was favored by natural selection. And it's thought that the first milky substances that were expressed by synapsids 300 plus million years ago were either to keep soft shell eggs hydrated, right, and keep them from drying out, or to provide important immunofactors across the permeable shell membrane to the developing young. We don't know, but it's very clear that those were two of the earliest purposes of milk. But since that time, milk has diversified among the thousands of mammals that are living today and has allowed mammals to live in environments and rear their young in environments in which the young could not otherwise survive. So mothers are able to produce milk away away from food sources and support the infant while they're developing. And this has led to a number of important mammalian adaptations, such as complex social relationships. Because the first social relationship a mammal has is the one it has with its mother. For some mammals, it's their only social relationship. So I talk about milk a lot, but it's important to keep in mind that milk is part of a complex lactation strategy that has 4 interrelated dimensions. Okay? So the first thing is, how long does the period of lactation last from birth until the end of weaning? Right? And here we have 2 of the champions among mammals. The first, of course, is orangutans, who are known to produce milk for up to 7 years to support their young. Okay? And it's because, or thought to be because, extracting food from the environment and processing it and learning how to do that takes a really, really long time for an orangutan infant to be proficient and transition to their own adult diet. Right? And mother's milk supports them through this very extended learning process. The other is the hooded seal, and they lactate for a grand total of 4 days before the infant is weaned. This means that their milk is about 60% fat, and they actually transfer 14 pounds of fat in milk each day of lactation. So that baby basically plumps up its blubber layer over those days. And the reason it's thought that they do this lactation strategy is because they give birth on very unstable ice floes to avoid polar bears. So when you think about milk, you can't just think about how the infant's growing. You also have to think about what are the dangers and selective pressures within their environment, and they can become quite complex. There's also the frequency of nursing bouts, and this is how often does the infant get access to the nipple to suckle for milk. Right? So you have baboons, which are one of my favorite mammals, and they basically, at least in the early period of infancy, the babies have contact with the nipple pretty much whenever they want. Right? So here's a mother who's walking, and her infant is literally suckling while she does that. Okay? Then you have rabbits, where the mother is away from the den most of the day. She only comes back and lets down her milk once the entire 24-hour time period. And it's thought that this is to minimize the time she goes to and from the den and leaves a scent trail to attract predators. Echidnas, which are a really funky egg-laying marsupial, they only nurse every 3 days. There's also the size of the litter. How many infants is that mother supporting at a single time? And within that, and we'll talk about this more later, is what is the sex ratio? How many sons versus how many daughters is she rearing at a time? And of course, how long you lactate, how frequently you lactate, and how many offspring you are producing is going to be really, really important for the amount of milk you produce and the composition of the milk you produce. Right? So if you're only nursing your infant for 4 days, like a hooded seal, you need to transfer a lot of fat. If you're nursing your young for 7 years and you're transferring that much fat, you are going to quickly deplete your bodily resources and not be able to sustain lactation. Now, although milk composition and milk yield are really, really important, milk composition, real quickly, this includes, as I mentioned in the Magic Potion introduction, the vitamins, minerals, fats, proteins, immunofactors, and water. Hormones also. But despite this incredible importance of what mother's milk is, we still don't know all the constituents that are present in milk. They have not yet been described. We do not know how they get into milk. Are they translocated from the mother's periphery? Are they manufactured in the mammary gland? We don't know. And we really don't know what happens when these constituents are ingested in the infant. And this is astonishing to me, and I know we all love to see data. So here's the data. If you put in keywords into PubMed that have to do with lactation and breast milk composition, you can see that there is an incredible shortage of information. This is the first food a mammal has evolved to consume, and yet we still know almost nothing about it. And this should make you angry. Right? Because we now know that, from what we do know, that there are aspects of mother's milk that can help us to address the biggest medical crises facing the globe today. Right? So first, for the first time in human history, human health is more threatened by being overweight than being underweight. And it's been shown that breastfeeding is protective against developing obesity in children. About 5 million kids globally annually get intense diarrheal disease, and 1.5 million of them will die. The ones that survive often experience stunted growth and a number of later deficits because of these problematic illnesses. It's now been shown, and I'll show you the data later in the talk, that there are constituents in milk that are protective against diarrheal disease. And 15 million children worldwide are born prematurely. It has been shown repeatedly in clinical trials that breast milk is the safest and healthiest thing to feed a premature infant that is housed in a neonatal intensive care unit. It is also much less costly to feed them with either their mother's own breast milk or donor milk than with formula in terms of the long-term health costs. In the last year, it's now been shown that there are constituents in mother's milk that can kill the HIV virus, and that there are stem cells in breast milk that are pluripotent. This means that those stem cells can develop into any of the 3 germline cells, into cells from any of the 3 germlines, more accurate way to say that. And up until now, the only stem cells that they know can do that are embryonic stem cells. So this is a source of non-invasive pluripotent stem cells. And we all know that the potential for pluripotent stem cells in terms of medical technology is really important and underutilized because of a number of ethical concerns with using embryonic stem cells. These are the big picture implications. This is what we talk about when we go to NIH and ask them for funding for this incredibly understudied area. But I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I approach milk in a slightly different way. I approach it through an evolutionary lens. And this is one of the few substances in a mammalian body that isn't exclusively the mother's. And what I mean by that is that there are adaptations operating in the mother and adaptations operating in the infant that can influence the milk that mothers produce. So we know that natural selection has shaped adaptations in the mother that are going to influence the milk she produces. And from a mother's perspective, she has adaptations that have been shaped through natural selection to maximize her lifetime reproductive output. Okay? This is really important because a lot of times when people think about milk, they think about mothers are going to make milk to support that baby, to maximize that baby's development. But this is not necessarily true, because mothers are trying to produce the highest number of high-quality offspring across an entire reproductive career. She's equally related to all her offspring, and natural selection is going to favor traits that maximize your reproductive success across a lifespan, not necessarily how well you invest in a single infant. Now, all else being equal, all else being equal, we would expect her to invest in each of her offspring the same, right? She's equally related to all of them. But we know that all else isn't equal, and we can predict that where a mother is in her reproductive career is going to be very important for the resources she has available to invest in that infant, and whether or not she's going to be protecting her own condition for future reproduction. Okay? So, I just said all that, sorry. So here is a young macaque mother on her first and her second infant. Most mammals initiate their reproductive careers when they are young and they are still growing. Okay? This means that all of their resources have to be spent on maintaining their own body, their own continued growth, and the energy and resources it takes to build your baby. Right? And this means systematically that these young mothers on their first and their second infant have more trade-offs between maintenance, reproduction, and growth. Because they're still growing, they have fewer resources in the first place. And because you have to have your infant of a certain threshold condition in order to survive, the infants in proportion to the mother are bigger and more costly. So these young mothers have more to pay for, less to pay with, and more things that they're paying into. So we can predict that this is going to influence how they allocate resources and synthesize milk on these early reproductive efforts. And indeed, empirically, we know that these young mothers are at greater risk for miscarriage and premature delivery. They're more likely to experience infant death. They are not as good at behavioral care. They're first-time moms. They're still learning. And from an evolutionary perspective, we would say that they have lower quality infants. They're smaller. They're not as healthy. They're less likely to survive. And this is in part thought to be because they need to protect themselves for an entire future career of reproduction. Right? If they invest too much early on, then they can stunt their own growth and reduce their future reproductive potential. Whereas a prime-aged mother, she doesn't have the trade-offs with her own growth and development. She has ample resources. She has experience being a mom. But she still might invest slightly less than the maximum because she has future reproduction still available to her. And this is in contrast with a very aged mother who's on her last infant. And in evolutionary biology, this is known as the terminal investment hypothesis. Now that's what's going on in the mom and things that may be influencing how moms are able to invest in the young. Now, it's important to also keep in mind that animals are not making conscious decisions about how to invest in their infant. Rather, natural selection has shaped adaptations to make them differentially sensitive to energy balance or infant cues. Okay? So it's very important to keep in mind that I don't think mothers are using cognitive processes to make those decisions. These are physiological adaptations. At the same time, it's important to think that infants have adaptations in them that are going to influence how they acquire and utilize mother's milk. Okay? So imagine this firstborn infant. Right? He's 100% related to himself. All his genes are his, unless he's a chimera, but we're not going to think about that right now. And he's only 25 to 50% related to his future siblings. Okay? So if they're full siblings, it's 50% on average. If they're half siblings, it's 25%. So Trivers in 1972 and 74 and 73 laid out some really nice papers that explained why infants might want more resources than the mother wants to give. And anybody who has encountered an infant weaning tantrum is well aware of the different tactics infants can use to get their mother to give them more of what they want. And so when you're studying milk, it's very challenging because milk is the compromise between adaptations operating in the mother and adaptations operating in the infant. If the infant is behaviorally manipulating the mother to allow him to nurse more often, that is going to change milk composition. Okay? I study, which is often referred to in neuroscience papers as the monkey. This is rhesus macaques, Macaca mulatta. And they're a really excellent model because they share a lot of traits with humans. One is they're what's known as a weed species. They've been incredibly successful in a variety of ecologies all through Asia. And they're even very, very good at exploiting human environments. So I don't know if you can read this article from where you're sitting, but this is New Delhi, November 13th, 2007. The authorities here managed to do very little about the city's soaring wild monkey population until the deputy mayor toppled from his terrace to his death as he tried to fend off a gang of the animals. So they don't have the best reputation for being nice animals. They can be fairly feisty, but they're incredibly successful in exploiting a number of environments, just like the human species. Their genome's been described, so it allows us a lot of leverage to look at potential genetics. And they have very complex behavioral social relationships. The monkeys I work with are at the California National Primate Research Center in Davis, California. It's one of many nationally funded primate research centers. And at that location, the animals live in these very large, half-acre outdoor corrals. And they live there in social groups that are identical to what you would see in the wild. So they're made up of close relatives, distant relatives, and non-relatives, and they engage in the full suite of normal social behavior that you would see in the wild. And this is really important for me in my research because I'm interested in how milk, in part, contributes to infant social development. Here are, there's actually 24 outdoor corrals in which we collect data from multiple different groups. And as I mentioned, the animals are able to engage in all the same friendly grooming behaviors as well as typical social conflict and aggression. I've been running this research program at California National Primate Research Center since 2005, and we've been able to collect over 10,000 mils of milk from hundreds of mothers, and often at multiple time points during lactation. So this is the largest milk study outside of a dairy cow or human model. And we've used these data to ask some very specific questions about how much does the milk composition vary among individuals? Right? Is milk the same from mother to mother, or does it indeed vary across individuals? What are the sources of that variation? And what are the consequences for the infant in terms of growth, behavior, temperament, and later life transitions into adulthood and reproductive maturity? And I'll be sharing a number of the key findings from these studies with you this evening. One thing to keep in mind about rhesus macaques is that they're seasonal breeders. They breed in the fall. They have a 5.5-month gestation. Babies are born during the birth season in March through June, and then they basically lactate for 5 to 8 months, and this varies across mothers for reasons that have to do with maternal trade-offs. And across lactation, it very much mimics what we see in humans and other species that have long periods of lactation, in that there's this early period at 1 month, and this marks when infants start playing and spending time away from their mother. It's an important time period of cognitive development and behavioral development. Peak lactation falls about 3 to 4 months of age, and then weaning is begun somewhere around 5 to 6, sometimes a little bit earlier, sometimes a little bit later. But weaning the infant becomes really, really important because since these are seasonal breeders, they need to have transitioned and started to recover their condition in order to get pregnant with the next kiddo. Right? If they don't wean their infant and they're still mobilizing a lot of energy to make milk, they will not cycle, they will not get pregnant, and they will miss out on an entire year of reproduction. They don't get another chance. Right? So there's a lot of selective pressure for maximizing reproductive output, and this leads to when the mothers are going to wean. Now, I mentioned that mothers vary across their lifespan and how they might be investing in their infants, but it's also important to keep in mind that infants aren't all the same. And one of the key things that we look at in our lab is why milk might differ between sons and daughters. Horribly anthropomorphized here. I'll be using the bow tie and the pink bow throughout to just differentiate males and females, because you can't really tell on a baby monkey if you don't have some kind of symbol like that. And sons and daughters oftentimes have different developmental trajectories, so they develop at different rates and in different ways. Because of this, they might have different costs for the mother in terms of her mobilizing the milk that they need for their particular developmental trajectory. And I'll return later to they may have different value, right? So in terms of what is selection favoring in terms of traits, it's how many offspring you produce that go on to also produce offspring, right? How many copies of your genes do you get into subsequent generations? And the ability of sons to produce more offspring or daughters to produce more offspring is going to vary across species and across individuals within species. And this may be a factor in how mothers are favoring sons or daughters. And the signature of these things may be in milk. They may be facilitated by milk. And indeed, to date, this has been the first paper came out in 2005, and it's been increasing. Not all the studies have all the most important controls necessarily, and not all the studies show sex biases. So we are still very much learning this. But to date, there's now been demonstrations that mothers produce different amounts of milk for sons and daughters. There can be different amounts of fat in the milk for sons and daughters. You'll notice I'm not saying who they're favoring yet. There can be differences. Oh, the little asterisks are which species we have data from, okay, that support this. There can be differences in the mineral content in milk for sons and daughters, differences in protein, and differences in hormones, right? So these are species across mammals, right? So rodents and humans have been separated. Our last common ancestor was about 90 million years ago. And this is popping up across mammals, even in wallabies, which are, the Tamar wallaby is basically a mini kangaroo. And of course, a marsupial biologist would hate that I just said that, but just imagine, it's like a kangaroo. And there isn't a take-home message about this yet. I would consider a lot of these data to be very, very preliminary. But there is growing suggestions and demonstrations that milk differs for sons and daughters, okay? And in seemingly systematic ways. I'll be presenting the data that we have from the macaques because in my work, we always control for the infant's body mass. In many mammal species, sons are bigger than daughters. And what you want to know is, are they making milk specific to the sex chromosomes of the infant? Or are they just making the same amount of milk per unit mass of infant? In seals and sea lions, the evidence suggests that the milk is per unit mass. Okay? In the macaques, the suggestion is that it's specific to the sex of the infant. And when we're talking about animals, we use sex and not gender, because gender is about identity, and the monkeys have not told me what they identify as. So I go with sex chromosomes. Are they XX or XY? And what I've been able to find is that they make richer milk for sons than they do for daughters. It's higher in fat content, and also it's more nuanced, but higher in protein. But pooling all of the subjects together obscures a really interesting effect, which is that this is largely driven by the mother's parity. So these first-time moms who are very small and still growing and lactating for the first time, they make significantly richer milk for sons and significantly more dilute milk for daughters. But the energy content of milk is only half of the story. Because what's really, really important is how much milk are they making, right? So you can compare like a stick of butter to a gallon of half and half, and it doesn't really, you can just look at the amount of fat in it, but if I don't tell you how much of it I ate, you really don't know how many calories I'm getting. And in the macaques, we find that mothers make significantly more milk for their daughters. There's also evidence from other species that there's more milk for either sons or daughters. But what's really important is, how is this happening? And right now, there's only 2 studies that show us that. Okay? Oh, sorry, real quickly. One of the things that we also know about primates, and this is true for macaques and chimpanzees and humans, is that the skeletons of daughters develop faster than the skeletons of sons. So if you look here, these are epiphyseal connections in the finger bones. They ossify, so they basically transition from cartilage to bone at a faster rate in daughters than in sons. So I hypothesize that this may be facilitated by differences in the calcium content in the milk of mothers that are rearing daughters. And indeed, we find that the calcium is higher than in milk for daughters than in milk for sons. The phosphorus is the same, so the calcium-phosphorus ratio is elevated for daughters, and this ratio is really important for bone ossification. And daughters are getting significantly more milk. So this looks like mothers are transferring more skeletal calcium to daughters than they are to sons. We need to do follow-up work actually looking at the rates of bone development among these individuals, but it's strongly suggestive that some components of mother's milk may be facilitating this faster rate of development. The question then becomes, how does the mammary know it's producing milk for a son or a daughter, right? It's like the old thermos joke. It keeps hot things hot and cold things cold, but how does it know, right? And there's been one study published to date that I've been able to find, and it's quite wonderful. It was done with bank voles. And what they did is after the babies were born, they switched around the litters. And so they created all male and all female litters after birth. And they found that the bank voles that were rearing all daughter litters increased their milk production in response to these daughters. So this demonstrates that postnatal behavioral manipulation can influence the milk that mothers synthesize. However, functional development of the mammary gland occurs during pregnancy. Right? Hormonal signals of pregnancy cause differential mammary gland development and can be very important for milk that's synthesized afterwards. We know this from really elegant work in goats, showing that when a goat is gestating twins versus singletons, a lot more milk is produced. So in collaboration with colleagues at Kansas State University, Gail Carpenter and Barry Bradford, we decided that a cow model would give us an incredible opportunity to look at milk production in relation to the sex of the fetus. Okay. So we collected dairy records from 1995 to 1999, so about 2.5 million dairy records from 1.5 million subjects. And the dairy cow is really great because the calf is pulled at birth. So if there's differences in milk production, if you have a son or a daughter, it can be attributed to fetal signals during pregnancy. And I'll acquaint you to this figure right now. Here is the first 5 pregnancies or parities that cows experience. This is the female advantage in milk production, so how many kilograms more milk did she produce over a 305-day lactation period. And everything that's above the 0 indicates that the milk production favored daughters. Anything that would fall below the 0 would represent favoring sons. You'll notice that nothing falls below 0 on this graph. Across all of the first 5 lactations that dairy cows have, they produce significantly more milk after gestating a daughter than after they gestated a son. This is about 1.5% more milk on average. Now, this is a summary of that result, that the fetal sex influences the milk that's produced during lactation. But one of the other really nice things about the dairy cow model is they get pregnant while they're lactating. And so we wondered, does the sex of the fetus affect milk production that's happening while the fetus is being gestated? Okay. So this is an example. So we know that the fetus before lactation affects milk production, but what about the signals that they're getting from a son or a daughter during lactation? So I'll orient you to the graph. Here is 305-day milk yield. Dairy cows make a lot of milk. And along the x-axis, we have if they gestated a son, then a son, then a daughter, then a son, or a daughter, then a daughter. And what we found was that if you had gestated a son and again gestated a son, your milk production was significantly lower than if you gestated a daughter after gestating a son. Okay. But if you gestated a daughter on your first pregnancy, you produced more milk and were impervious to whether your fetus was a son or a daughter. So this shows you that there's complex interactions across lactations in terms of the sex of the infant, right? Now, we know that mammary development is additive across lactations, and so we thought the milk the sex that's gestated on the first pregnancy could carry forward and have consequences for later. And indeed, again, that's exactly what we found. So if you gestated a daughter on your first pregnancy, you produce significantly more milk on your second lactation. We're talking about almost 2 years apart that effect of that daughter was persisting. So you have complex interactions across and within parities in terms of milk production. Now, why might this be happening? The cow placenta has a substantial amount of surface area, and we think that estrogens from daughters are crossing the placenta into maternal circulation and amplifying the estrogen signal that's affecting mammary gland development during pregnancy. Okay? Whereas sons cannot send as high of estrogen signals without inhibiting their own testicular development. So they might be able to send a signal, right, because males can make both estrogen and androgens, but it could affect their future reproduction. Now, what is the economic impact of this? Right? The dairy industry is one of the main agricultural industries in this country, and we can quantify that if you use sexed sperm and make sure that your heifer conceives a daughter on her first pregnancy, you will get about 1,000 pounds more milk across those first 2 lactations. And I went to go and calculate what that meant in terms of dairy dollars, and the government shut down. I happen to know that as of 4 months ago, we're talking about $200 million if all dairy farmers did that with their first-time heifers. Okay. Now, that's not counting the lot, complicated. That's not net gain. That's just absolute value of the milk. And the question then becomes, why sons and why daughters? Right? Now, it could be that this is just a byproduct of fetal hormones crossing the placenta into maternal circulation. There's nothing that mothers can really do about it, and they're not making that much of a dent in their milk production. We don't know. There's been a lot of debate in the evolutionary biology literature basically saying quite strongly that mothers should favor sons. Okay? Sons need to be big. In most mammal species, they have to fight for access to females. They have the potential to mate with many, many females. And so from an evolutionary perspective, mothers should have adaptations that allow them to allocate extra resources to sons. Our data suggests that this is not what is going on, that across female conditions, there is universal bias in terms of milk production in favor of daughters, and no differences in milk composition in the dairy cow. And this is, male reproductive success is the number of females he can monopolize. But female reproductive success is a little bit trickier. So it's her access to resources so that she can maintain her condition, so she can, reproduce. But it's also the length of her reproductive career, because the amount of time you can be pregnant and lactate is very fixed, right? There's not much flexibility in those. So how many kids you can have during your reproductive career is going to be a function of how long you stay alive and your age at first birth when you initiate reproduction. So from a mother's perspective, getting your daughter to reproductive maturity may be the best way to increase her reproductive success and therefore your own fitness. With sons, they can slow play that one. Okay? They have ample time to get big and get badass, all right, before they have to compete for females. And so you might predict, despite the overwhelming citation rate of Trivers Willard, that daughters may require more maternal investment in order to return grand offspring. Now, real quickly, mother's milk does not just grow the infant. that early postnatal period is really important for socially complex mammals to begin to be behaviorally active. So mother-infant interactions, exploration, I love juxtapositioning the monkey with the human. Social experience, which is a highfalutin way to say playing. These are all supported and shaped in the context of mother's milk. And we now know from rodents, humans, and monkeys that mother's milk is predictive of behavior and temperament of these species. So the nicest, most elegant, most wonderful work is done by a group in Italy where they're looking at rats. And basically, they provide them with glucocorticoids. In rodents, it's called corticosterone, but you would know it more likely as cortisol. I hate saying this because it's such an oversimplification and really problematic. But in popular science literature, it's called the stress hormone. Immediately forget you heard that because it's much more complicated. But they give the rat mothers glucocorticoids in milk, in their water. It shows up in their milk. And it has these long-term consequences for the pups. So as juveniles, rats exposed to milk corticosterone are better at spatial memory and have better cognitive processing. So they're able to solve different kinds of mazes more effectively. As adults, rats exposed to corticosterone through milk are less behaviorally inhibited and more exploratory and less stressed by being put into a novel experimental apparatus. So here's an elevated plus maze. 2 of the arms are open, 2 of the arms are enclosed. Animals that spend a lot of time in the open arms are less fearful, more exploratory. And they've even been able to find what structures in the brain are shaping these behavioral differences. And it basically, by getting more glucocorticoids in milk during infancy, they have more glucocorticoid receptors in their hippocampus, which is a really important part of the brain that helps regulate the HPA axis. Now, I want to draw your attention to the fact that this effect has been shown in males. The behavioral effects are in both males and females, but the neural structures that underlie it have only been identified so far in males. Females don't have higher glucocorticoid receptor density in their hippocampus. In monkeys, higher milk cortisol is associated with being more confident and exploratory and playful in males. And recently, a paper just came out showing that in humans, higher cortisol levels in milk are associated with negative affect. So they're more fearful, more sad, they're less soothable, and show greater signs of discomfort for daughters. This indicates to us that even in the absence of sex differences in milk, there could be sex differences in adaptations for how infants are absorbing and utilizing the milk, because sons and daughters are responding in different ways to milk glucocorticoids. I recently also showed with John Capitano, a psychology professor at UC Davis who runs a biobehavioral assessment program on thousands of baby monkeys, that if you get higher available milk energy at 1 month of age when you first become behaviorally active, available milk energy is the number of calories in milk, which is a combination of composition and yield, that those infants are more behaviorally active and exploratory and playful. And here are data showing that with a number of very important controls. As available milk energy at 1 month goes up, their infant activity factor increases 2.5 months later. And this is independent of the available milk energy that they're getting at this time. These data indicate that during critical windows of neurodevelopment, mother's milk is shaping the brain with consequences for behavior. And further research on this is currently awaiting funding. There are some problems, right? So the 2 sets of studies have looked at glucocorticoids and then milk energy. They actually aren't integrating glucocorticoids with energy. And this is a problem because we know that cortisol in milk is correlated with fat and protein and volume of milk. So when you're getting a signature of cortisol, is it really cortisol or is it these other variables? We don't know. And it's really important because even though I kind of said cortisol is a stress hormone, which is not, cortisol is a metabolic hormone. And it's very important for signaling how you utilize and store energy. So it's going to be very important for studies to integrate glucocorticoid hormonal work with the nutrition energy work in mother's milk. I have that data, but it's unpublished, so you'll have to stay tuned and check out my blog where I'll be reporting it once it's published. All right, in the last few minutes, I want to just touch on a couple things, which is that mother's milk does not just feed the infant. The third most common constituent in mother's milk in humans is oligosaccharides. And human infants do not have the enzymes to break these oligosaccharides down. We do not digest them. They are the preferred source for our microbiota. So mothers are making milk to feed the microbiome of her infant. So we know, I mean, this is everywhere, the microbiome is really hot right now. That's why Rachel's in the audience, I imagine. And these bacteria are really important for regulating how we acquire nutrients in our diet, for affecting our immune response. And if you aren't colonized by really good bacteria, then pathogenic bacteria are going to get some of your intestinal landscape and cause you all sorts of problems. These are some of the issues that are underlying children having diarrheal disease. And we now know that there is evidence for coevolution between particular oligosaccharides and the most beneficial bacteria that colonize an infant's gut. These are complex sugars. And we also know that the oligosaccharides that humans make are very different in many ways from the oligosaccharides present in the milk of other species. It's now been described that humans are making about 500 different milk oligosaccharides, and near as we can tell, chimpanzees make 30. So this is over an order of magnitude difference since our last common ancestor. Within a species, even though humans are making about 500 in total, individual mothers are making maybe 50, maybe 100. And we don't entirely know all of the reasons for that. Part of it has to do with whether or not they're a secretor and fucosylate these oligosaccharides, but much of the variation remains to be explained. Mother's milk does not just feed the intestinal bacteria. Bacteria are also present in milk. So in the rhesus macaques I work with, we've looked at lactic acid bacteria, which is a very beneficial bacteria. It's very important for accessing minerals from food that you've eaten. They basically increase the availability of those minerals. L-reuteri is really important for fighting rotavirus. And these over 106 strains of bacteria, of lactic acid bacteria alone, have been found in the mother's milk. Okay? And it's hypothesized, we still don't know how they get there. Is it skin contamination? Is it some internal pathway through the mother's lymphatic system? We don't know. And there's a lot of variation across individuals in terms of what bacteria are present in their milk. Is there some kind of selective uptake where the most beneficial bacteria are provided in milk? Is it a variety of bacteria to help entrain the infant's intestinal tract and immune system? These are open questions that are really important to address. So I hope in the last 45 minutes I've convinced you that we need to think of milk as not just food, but also as medicine and an important hormonal signal, all interacting together in as yet not understood complex ways. And we need to understand it, because the science is really important for babies and mothers and people who love babies and mothers. Okay? And this is one of the most important parts of the talk to me, because I love the science. I stay up late at night thinking about the science. But science is only as useful as it is when translated into people's real lives. And the message that milk is a magic potion has reached mothers. They know how important breast milk is for infant development in a multitude of ways. But most mothers in this country are not able to meet their breastfeeding goals. And this is due to a variety of systematic problems and how we as a society are failing mothers. The first is that we are not very upfront about the fact that breastfeeding is physiologically hard, okay? Whether you're talking to my cousin right here with her baby, or Lulu, or as I was a month ago talking to Hinde women in Namibia, mothers experience a number of challenges with breastfeeding: milk letdown, infant latch, abrasions, mastitis. There are a number of things that just make breastfeeding physiologically hard. And that's because there's this myth that because breastfeeding is natural and it's evolved, that it should be easy and people should be automatically good at it. And this is ludicrous, because if you think of something else that's ancient and evolved, sex, nobody starts out being good at it, right? And so this idea that things that are natural should automatically be easy really needs to be uncoupled. Okay? And we need to do more prenatal breastfeeding support. Okay? Right now, lactation consultants and counselors show up once there's already been a problem. Once mothers, after giving birth or having a C-section, okay, very traumatic physical experiences, are in the hospital, their baby's crying, they aren't letting down their milk, and they have hormones rushing around, and they feel like they're failing as mothers. Okay? We need to help prepare them better before it gets to that point, by better training of medical staff. And secondly, institutional barriers remain that keep women from meeting their breastfeeding goals. Okay? In the United States, we still do not have mandatory maternity leave. Okay? And we know the socioeconomic situation. Right? More and more, you need to have two-income households. And mothers cannot stay home if they want to breastfeed their infants. They have to go back to work very quickly. And when they get to work, they don't always have access to safe, clean places to pump. They may have safe, clean places to pump because the Affordable Care Act now mandates that and mandates break time in order to pump. But it doesn't change the fact that a lot of women experience social and professional stigma by taking the time to step away from the workplace to go and pump for her infant. We need to do better. We need to do better for our mothers. There's lots of messaging about how breast milk is really important for the infants, but what we are doing is setting up mothers to feel like failures when they cannot meet their breastfeeding goals. We need to do better. And for mothers who don't breastfeed, for whatever reason, it's not part of their cultural landscape, they have to work and do not have options to pump because it's contraindicated because of medical conditions. We owe these mothers a better formula. Right now, formulas are only representing the nutritional components of milk, not the hormonal and not the medicinal components of milk. Okay? And this is the danger of, and those formulas represent the average. One of the things I've talked about over and over and over again in this talk is that there is variation around the mean. So when we're providing a formula that's standardized, one size fits all, we can be overfeeding and underfeeding individual babies. So let's think about George Carlin's quote. Okay? Think of how stupid the average person is, and realize that half of them are stupider than that. Now, I don't think people are stupid, but it's a wonderful example of what happens when we always think in averages, when we think in means. I spent time talking about how there's data that suggests that sons and daughters get different milk. Okay? We need a lot more research before we can actually start formulating infant replacement food with that in mind, but we need to do the research, right? We make different deodorant for males and females, and yet we're doing one-size-fits-all formula for babies? This is ludicrous to me. So in conclusion, I've talked a little bit about what we know, but there is so much more that we have to find out. It's important theoretically, it's important clinically, it's important socially. we need to be changing the number of papers you get back when you enter these key search terms into PubMed. Thank you very much. And thank you to my lab and all my funders. And we have time for questions. Or you can race out to go catch the game, which starts in like 10 minutes. And if you want to holler at me, I'll repeat your question into the microphone if you don't want to go to one of these microphones.
You talked about the differences between young mothers and prime mothers.
Mm-hmm.
Have you restricted the birth of young mothers to see if there's a difference between a first-time mother in her prime versus a prime mother giving her third and fourth child?
Yes, that is an excellent question. And we haven't done the experimental manipulation. But what I have done is, in the rhesus macaques, they can have their first birth when they're 3 years old, 4 years old, or 5 years old. And I'm really interested in looking at, are there differences across them in the milk that they produce? So there isn't any difference in the composition. So the amount of fat, protein, and sugar is about the same. But the amount of milk they produce is very different. And this is almost entirely attributable to the fact that a 5-year-old is much bigger than a 3-year-old. However, one of the things that we really want to analyze, and I don't have the results yet, is looking at how does that affect when they give birth the next time? What does their future reproduction look like? So if you start reproducing at 3, do you get a benefit, or do you take a hit in terms of you don't have an infant when you're 4 and then come back when you're 5? So looking at these things very dynamically across lactations. Great question. Yes?
Have you done research with, have you fed formula to apes, like to monkeys, or, and what are the consequences? Or have you compared like human infants that receive formula to human infants that receive breast milk?
That's a really good question. And it's not one that I have personally investigated for a couple reasons that I think are important to think about. If you want to formula feed a baby monkey, you have to remove it from its social group. So you're not just changing what it's consuming, you're changing everything about its social environment and its exposure to bacteria and pathogens and everything, right? And that can have some very long-lasting, potentially, perturbations, such that it's hard to isolate what's breast milk versus formula versus all these other things that have to change simultaneously. The second is there's lots of people that are looking at formula versus breastfeeding in humans. The problem is that you cannot, mothers, you can't experimentally design that and say, okay, you moms, you're going to formula feed, and you moms that are totally matched for all different variables are going to breastfeed. Right? Mothers are self-selecting what they're choosing to do. And there's a number of different attributes about mothers that are going to predict whether or not they breastfeed or formula feed. Okay? One of the things that I think is going to be a very important area of research, and I am not yet aware of anybody doing it, but an NIH program officer said this needs to be done, is looking at mothers that breastfeed, right? So they have the infant on the nipple and they breastfeed and have these contingent interactions back and forth with the baby while breastfeeding, versus mothers that pump and bottle feed breast milk. Right? It's a very different dynamic. And there's now evidence showing that there's actually breast milk backwash, that there's a vacuum effect so that saliva from the baby washes back into the mammary gland. And some people have hypothesized that this signals different things about the infant's health state and other things that are going to affect how the mother's producing milk. Right? These are hypotheses. We don't have data for that yet. But it suggests that a meal at the breast is very different than a meal at the bottle, even if both are breast milk. I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I'm really interested in looking at how mothers are allocating resources to breast milk and what that means for infant development. And so it's very important for me to look at, within a population or a species, what's the variation among mothers, right? Comparisons between breastfeeding and breast milk are obscuring the fact that there's lots of variation in breast milk that we really don't know about. There's a lot of clinical studies on breast milk versus breastfeeding. They're in the literature, but the kinds of questions I'm asking are fundamentally different. They're basically going back to what's the variation, why is it there, and what is it doing? And then from there, that tells us different ways that we can reformulate infant formulas.
I know that there's a substantial incentive to do lactation research in cows because of the economic product. But how valid a model organism is a cow when we've basically forced their evolution along, specifically for lactation?
Great question. So that's a really good one. So it turns out that looking at the genome of cows, platypus, humans, Danielle LeMay did this study, and she looked at like 5 different species and looked to see how natural and artificial selection had changed the genome. And what she found was that despite this intense selective pressure on cows, the areas of the genome that underlie lactation are actually changing more slowly than other aspects that have to do with body structure and coloration. That lactation genes seem to be particularly conservative in response to these manipulations. So it's a valid question, and I think, and I'm not saying that totally erases it, but it lets us know that lactation is a fairly conservative set of genes. And I think that what we need to do is look at it in different models. I think that in terms of trying to isolate a prenatal versus a postnatal effect, it's a really, really nice one because we know that any signal has to be from the fetus. Now, I mentioned that they have really large placental surface area. When I talked about all the species up there that have shown evidence of sex-biased milk synthesis, those are all, except for the wallaby, species that are characterized by either larger surface area or more invasive placentation. So basically species in which the infant's bloodstream is in more contact with the mother's bloodstream. So I think that what we're finding is that the probability of sex-biased or sex-differentiated milk synthesis is going to vary as a function of how easily those signals can get into the maternal bloodstream. And again, the cow is a really nice one because they have a placenta that facilitates fetal signaling. But we'd want to do it in a lot more species. Yes?
How do you get the macaques to contribute milk in your study?
Yes, so the question is, how do we do our sampling? We capture them from the corral and we anesthetize them. So they are anesthetized for the milk collection. And we give them oxytocin, which basically causes the milk to let down and be collected. There are possibilities. So the National Zoo was able to train a gorilla to come every day and allow a milk sample to be collected. It took a long time to train her, and it was one animal. So basically, we don't have the manpower or the time to train hundreds of macaque monkeys to do that. If we were going to do a more intense experimental manipulation kind of study where we're working with the same animals more frequently, then that would be a really worthwhile thing to do. Yes, question?
Something that I think I probably didn't get quite right to talk about was the role of cortisol. Just almost. Now, are we talking about cortisol, which is a response to some stressor, but also causes inflammation? And then I'm not sure if I got this right. It sounded like you were saying that it was a positive effect, but maybe that's not quite what I understood, or what?
No, that was. So the data that's been published so far in monkeys and in rodents suggests that cortisol influences a temperament that's more exploratory and playful and confident. Right? Now, I'm going to be somewhat agnostic as to whether or not that's beneficial. So if you are in an environment that has lots of predators, being incredibly overconfident can be very dangerous. If you are in an environment that has very few predators and you're very nervous, you might miss out on opportunities to forage or meet other individuals or things like that. And so I think that we have to think about temperament as how it serves the individual in the context of the environment that it's in before we say it's beneficial or detrimental. The work in humans suggests that ingesting cortisol has what would be considered a negative effect in terms of the temperament in our modern environment. So those infants are more fussy, less calm. And one, I think we can say that cortisol is associated with temperament, but I think we need a lot more work before we say exactly how it's working. The data I have that are unpublished suggests that sons and daughters are very differentially sensitive to cortisol in milk, but there aren't differences in the amount of cortisol in the milk that the mothers produce, which suggests that the amount of cortisol, or if cortisol is changing across lactation, is going to be very tightly coupled with things like glucocorticoid receptors in the oral cavity and intestinal tract. We know in mammals, in cows and rodents, that there are glucocorticoid receptors at pretty high density in the intestinal tract in infancy. And those glucocorticoid receptors actually start to disappear at weaning, which to me very strongly suggests that they're there to receive signals from mother's milk. But we don't know how the distribution of those glucocorticoids varies across infancy or how it might be different between sons and daughters. I mean, it's actually a fantastic field to be in because there's so many questions that remain unexplored. It's a very good one.
What about the inflammatory effect, which I don't know if you didn't mention that, but other than lactation, I mean, just anybody who is cortisol, what about that effect?
I don't know anything about it in terms of what it's doing in the infant. I mean, one of the other things is it could be a byproduct. It could have to do with inflammatory processes within the mammary gland, right? So synthesizing milk actually requires a lot of inflammation within the mammary gland. These are really important open questions. Really important open questions. Yes?
You talked about how in your own research you're studying animals that, monkeys that have the seasonal gestation period, and so they're no longer lactating when they become pregnant and have their next infant.
Mm-hmm.
What about animals that do get pregnant when they're lactating? Are there species, and humans, for example,
Mm-hmm.
are there species who do that and then go on to nurse their newborn infant and their older child or
Yes.
baby animal? And how does that work with the composition of the milk?
Excellent question. So this is known in a lot of lactation circles as tandem nursing, when you nurse a toddler and a baby simultaneously. So one of the things that's really interesting about humans is that and baboons and chimpanzees, actually, in the last couple of years, there's been papers in humans, baboons, and chimpanzees that show that mothers can conceive while they're lactating, but only if they're also gaining weight. Right? So the ability to conceive is very sensitive to energy balance. When you're losing weight, you don't have a lot of resources, you suppress ovulation. When you're gaining weight and recovered, then you can. And so in humans, a lot of populations, we have ample access to food resources, and so you see conception while lactating. There are a couple studies from cows, again, because animal science is really, really interested in these things like production. And what they found was that a fetus that is gestated while the mother is also nursing a calf or milk's being produced, that offspring has fewer eggs in their ovaries when they're born, that they produce 0.005% less milk when they start lactating, and they die 16 days earlier. Now, these are statistically significant effects because they've got giant sample sizes, but I think the biological effect of them is relatively small. in terms of what the milk composition is, if you're nursing a newborn and a toddler simultaneously, we don't know. Or if it's known, I'm completely unaware of that work. It's possible, but I go to a lot of the lactation conferences, and it's not something that's been a primary target of research effort.
But do you know of in nature animals, non-humans, I know humans do this, are there animals that will tandem nurse?
It's very, very uncommon. In my research, I had, out of the 289 mothers I've worked with, I had one female that tandem nursed a yearling and a newborn, and she lost a ton of weight and was of great concern to the veterinary staff. And they basically fed her a lot of extra food to help her recover. But it's not something that you see typically unless there's something that's happened to that older infant. So they don't generally allow both the older individual and the newborn to nurse simultaneously. But if the older individual gets sick or gets hurt or gets very emotionally upset, they will allow them to be on nipple. We don't know how much milk is being transferred. So, and we don't know what's happening at night when they sleep. So a lot of times when like a chimpanzee has a newborn, her older offspring starts sleeping in its own nest, is my understanding. I could be wrong. But there seems to be not a lot of overlap. And a lot of that has to do with, that would be an incredibly costly mobilization of that mother's reserves to sustain both of them under natural ecological conditions. It would delay, her recovery for the next reproductive effort. And those older individuals, they're just fine at foraging for their own food. So why would she sink more resources into them from an evolutionary perspective? Yes. Yes. Yeah, right. So in the monkeys I work with, the amount of fat and protein increases from early to mid-lactation. And then when you get out to weaning, all of a sudden it gets really high in fat and really high in sugar. Same with humans, same with every species. And this is just because of the biophysical properties of milk, right? So when you're making a lot of milk, you're synthesizing a lot of lactose, which is the primary sugar in milk. And through osmotic pressure, that sugar is what pulls water into the mammary gland and increases the volume of milk that's being produced, right? So if you're starting to wean your infant, right, there's not as much milk throughput the mammary gland. Lactose synthesis is downregulated. Less water is being pulled into the milk. And if there's less water in the milk diluting it, by necessity, the proportion that's fat and protein goes up. But the actual number of calories that are being transferred has gone way down because the volume's gone way down. And that's one thing that I run into with the monkeys is that, my lowest fat content may be 2%, highest is going to be 15% at peak lactation, right? That's a pretty big variation. But the amount of milk that's synthesized in a 3.5-hour period can be anywhere from 4 mils to over 60 mils. So the evidence suggests to me, as far as I know, that the variation in volume is much greater among mothers than the variation in the composition. And yet, volume is one of the things that's really, really, really hard to study. Yes?
My question is also related to that. So, like human beings don't have a natural point where they have to stop breastfeeding. So, would you say there's like after 6 months it doesn't make sense anymore to breastfeed because the milk doesn't get any better? And like, is there like a moment you would say, like some people breastfeed for 15 months, some people for 3 months. So, if human beings had like this natural necessity of stopping to breastfeed, when would you say that?
I would answer that there is a huge amount of variation among mothers and infants, and I would never tell a mother what she should or should not do with her body, which I know is something of a non-answer, but I think that we know just cross-culturally and looking in the fossil record as near as we can that there's a lot of variation. and that milk isn't just about food. It can also be about some components of immune function. It can be important for hormonal signals. We know hardly anything about the hormones in milk. And it can be also, a component to mother-infant bonding. And I mean, one other thing to think about is, these discussions about pumping and bottle feeding. Well, that gives fathers and other caretakers a lot of opportunity to interact and bond with that baby. And I think basically, fundamentally, there's pros and cons to all of these decisions at every time point, every week of lactation and infant rearing. And we need to do a better job of giving moms all the options that they want to have available. And what works for one mom might not work for another mom, and what works for one family might not work for another family. And I don't think, if you read the recommendations by the World Health Organization about exclusive breastfeeding to 6 months and continued breastfeeding from 12 to 24 months, they make it explicitly clear that these are suggested guidelines and that there should and is a lot of variation among mothers and infants. And basically these are goal-oriented benchmarks that are more important about providing infrastructure to support breastfeeding than they are about, I think, telling mothers what they should do. Yes?
Since you talk about the nutrition factor of the breast milk, can I ask a question? So when you talk about the friendly bacteria, protein-free bacteria, so when the mother is breastfeeding, is that beneficial to take, the free bacteria or friendly bacteria and kind of boost the immunity for the child? And also, you talk about the
Oligosaccharides.
I see a lot of sweetener, replacement as that under name. Is that safe? Or one more question, that the cholesterol is also used for a lot of immune support, not human, but the cow's cholesterol for the human immune system. Is that even, effective?
Okay, so the first question was, do we know what mothers should take to improve the bacterial composition of breast milk? And as far as I know, I don't know of any clinical recommendations for that at this time. There have been some clinical trials of giving moms like Lactobacillus reuteri to see how long it persists in their breast milk after they've been inoculated with it. But I don't think we're at a point of any kind of standard clinical recommendations. The second question was about, I remember the third question. What was the second question?
Yeah, artificial sweetener that oligosaccharides use as
Yeah, so oligosaccharides are actually, at this point, very difficult to manufacture and are not being added to formula. So they're not one of the sugars that are added to formula at this time. And I don't believe that they're being added to any other food sources at this time that I'm aware of. I don't believe so. I think that I know that the formula companies are very, very interested in oligosaccharides. Third question was about colostrum. So colostrum is really, really interesting because it actually has very low fat and it has really high oligosaccharides and really high proteins. And there's a couple papers that have come out that talked about the bacteria that are present in colostrum. So when a baby's born, it has had very little bacterial colonization. There's a recent paper out that suggests that there is some bacterial colonization in utero, but very limited. And these bacteria are really, really important for how we process and digest our food. So it looks like the colostrum is really important for helping to establish the microbiota right after birth, which are then going to be useful for digesting the food, right? So the intestinal tract is just not ready to process complex, mature milk, right? Colostrum really is basically getting the system up and running for later transitional and then mature milk. And so in that sense, you don't want necessarily in like clinical practice, and again, I am not a medical healthcare professional and am not in any way authorized to give any kind of clinical or medical advice, but in the sense that the complex mature milk is beyond the capacity for the neonate infant's tract to digest. So colostrum is really important to get.
How colostrum is beneficial to humans' immune system?
Oh, I don't know. No. So they're trying to increase things like lactoferrin and lysozyme in cow milk because these are important for humans' immune functions. That's really not my area of specialty, and I could say I know there's work on it being done, but I don't know what experts in that area think about it necessarily. Okay, thank you so much.